Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
This Ticker podcast is brought to you by Broadridge Financial Solutions.
Hi, everyone. I'm a little uneasy about AI, about artificial intelligence. Diligent listeners of this podcast may recall our story a while back on how computers are fast learning to be journalists. In fact, machines are set to displace workers in all sorts of fields. Positions in law, medicine, and finance, for example, are prime targets for a new wave of automation. So, if AI will become so pervasive, can it one day replace human directors on corporate boards? My guests today predict not, but they do expect it to profoundly change corporate governance. They say using AI to both analyze data and enhance a board's decision-making will soon be commonplace. And they warn, corporate directors must keep abreast of AI concepts to properly fulfill their fiduciary duties. Those that fall behind risk losing their company's competitive advantage. And I guess it follows, probably, their jobs as well. John Hotta is a board director and retired technology executive. John began his career conducting AI research for the Rand Corporation, and he's played key technology roles at Microsoft and Accenture. Today, he spends much of his time advising company boards on technology, including cybersecurity, privacy, and AI implementation. We'll also hear from Michael Tay. Mike leads Broadridge Financial Solutions corporate strategy, and he's also got an impressive pedigree. I think the most interesting thing about his background is that he was Director of Investments for TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program at the U.S. Department of Treasury. On this Ticker podcast, how to smartify your board and build your company's AI strategy. John and Mike speak at lots of governance conferences, so the first most obvious question I had was, how hep are corporate directors to AI? The first voice you'll hear is that of Mike.
Where are we along the spectrum here in terms of adopting AI?
I guess what I'd say is that the people that we talk to, there's probably a range of people. You know, there's folks that are in the early stages and experimenting. There are other ones that are a little bit down further on the curve and have been implementing and have real projects that are being implemented across their businesses. So there's probably a range of folks that I've encountered in terms of their awareness of artificial intelligence and the amount of effort and energy and investment that they've put into those types of technologies. But just generally speaking, what I would say is that investments overall, as a broad matter, have been growing across the board in every industry. And so, some stats that I'd like to throw out are, IDC, they forecast that, for cognitive AI, the spending will reach $77.6 billion by 2022. That number, is a number in and of itself, but that represents a five-year growth rate of 37%. So definitely, I think, in terms of the range is broad, but I'd say that the future, spending is going to be pretty big, just because of the potential that exists for AI type technologies.
Can I just add a couple of things too? The things I would add is that, I think artificial intelligence actually is a very easy concept for anyone to understand. And that is that AI is basically machines which are continually and constantly learning. So anything that the machine senses, it assesses and evaluates, and there's just a continuous loop of sensing, evaluation, assessing, and learning. And so if you think of AI is simply that, a constantly learning system, a constantly learning machine. It's a really easy concept to understand. And I do think that there are some C-level members who make it seemingly more complicated than that for directors. And so there's a little bit of, I know something that you don't know. But I really think that this concept is incredibly easy for any director to understand. And I think, as we'll get into next hour, Michael and I will talk about how directors can take AI to the boardroom, to apply it to strategy, to apply it to risk, to apply it to other areas in the boardroom.
What's your sense of sort of different geographies picking up on this? Are you sensing, some areas of the world where they're further along the route than others?
Okay, so my opinion is that I do feel that Asia is more advanced in terms of artificial intelligence and maybe technology in general. I think that there is a more coordinated effort between government and private industry to further along technology and artificial intelligence. So I see that more in Asia and Southeast Asia. Obviously, in North America, both Canada and the U.S., there's quite a bit of investment and furthering of AI. Also, in places like the UK and other parts of the EU and the EU have a lot of AI investments too. India is another great example where there is quite a bit of AI investment and probably technology leadership in the coming years.
This is an opportunity to leapfrog. I mean, what happens to companies that just don't get on the bandwagon? These blissfully unaware directors, wherever they be, say Europe or North America. I mean, what are the consequences of falling behind?
Again, I have my opinion. Michael, do you want to start first, or do you want to start? Okay, so I personally believe that AI is an area for all directors and C-level management to consider because, as you're pointing out, every company, every competitor is thinking about AI. AI is so much broader than things like blockchain, which is much more narrow in terms of technology. I mean, AI is a platform. It's a whole area of growth in the future. And so, to use AI in parts of the business today is incredibly important, and over time it will be pieced together in other parts of the business too, to piece together with other parts of the business to really form something that is formidable, right? It's a constantly learning organization, constantly learning system that will, as you're saying, can possibly leapfrog competitors. So, I think that the competition is driving the use of AI, or should be driving the use of AI for a company's business.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the other thing I would just add is just generally speaking, AI is becoming everywhere. And the reason why it's becoming everywhere is a couple of trends. One, which is that there's just more data. And, part of that has to do with, Internet of Things and wearables, the smartification of formerly siloed devices. But really, there's facial recognition, finding cameras. There's a lot of opportunities to get data. And then the other thing is just around computing power, and because that continues to exponentially grow, and there's Moore's law, which I think a lot of us are aware of, but it's really in terms of the circuit square inch and surface area of a circuit, and how that doubles every 18 to 2 years in terms of the number of transistors that you can put on that. It continues to grow. And so you have computing power on one side, you have data on the other, and you add that together. And, the trends are definitely that AI is becoming a bigger and bigger part of how businesses do business. And so if you're not on that, then you're definitely at a threat to fall behind if your competitors are adopting.
I always like to remind people is that AI is on our mobile phone today. And the example I always use is Waze, which is an app that helps me get to a location faster. Because, Waze is completely or is very much AI enabled. And it's constantly sensing data, as Michael was saying a few minutes ago, of the traffic and traffic patterns and what new construction is happening, and therefore calculating a new route to get to my destination faster. So, when I talk to directors about what AI is, I usually point to their phone and say, here's an app that you probably are using, which is an example of AI that people are using on a day-to-day basis.
So AI is already here and people are already using it. Before we go any further, I wonder if someone can speak sort of on the celestial level.
there's opportunities and risks for business, but also humanity, the universe, and everything. Because I'd like to look at the future, sort of medium and long term, because I think maybe long term, AI is going to be very different from now, and the medium term. It would be more along the lines of replace rather than augment, and that may be scary. Can anyone speak to that?
I personally see AI as an enabler of humanity. I personally see that machines are something that can augment human life and can make human life better. And so I do believe that AI is something that will help humanity. You can see already that it helps humanity in terms of healthcare. There is quite a bit of AI used in diagnosis of diseases and in looking at X-rays and different images. So that's an example of where I think that AI will be helpful to humanity in the future. I think there is big risks. That's the obvious part, right? And the obvious part is it takes leadership. So the people who are listening to this podcast need to take leadership in making sure that there's ethical use of AI. And that means increased transparency of how algorithms are used and developed. There's increased use. And, I think boardrooms and leaders need to make decisions about how AI is used. Just because you can do something with AI doesn't mean that you should be doing something with AI. So that's just something that humans need to do and step up on.
But you need a kill switch on that.
Right, exactly. There's some really interesting things that Microsoft has suggested, who I think does a good job at ethically using AI, which is that yes, there should be a kill switch on AI, so that someone can turn it off. I'm sorry, Michael, you were going to say something.
No, I was agreeing with that. Everything that you said. I was going to add another point just around job losses, and I think one of the big threats around AI is that it will lead to massive unemployment. And, I think I agree with everything that John said, which is that I think it'll augment and be a boon with risks, of course. But, one thing that I like to talk about is that if you look at jobs within the U.S. and you look over the history of time, in the 1700s, the U.S. was largely an agrarian society. And so the percentage of jobs that were focused on farming was over 80%. And then you had the Industrial Revolution, and that was clearly, a whole set of innovation that really changed the way our economy and the way technology was applied to businesses. And so that really, that dramatically increased the proportion of jobs to manufacturing as agrarian and farming type jobs went away. And then over the past five decades, or the past 50 years, you've seen that part of industry change. And so manufacturing as a percentage of total jobs has then, subsequently have decreased over time, and that's been replaced by something else. And so my point is, you'll have, but if you looked over that long period of time over the past 2 or 3 centuries, it's a steady increase in terms of economic output, in terms of number of jobs. Obviously, there's population increase as well. But what I'd say is that AI is not something that we should be scared of. It's something that actually really has improved the economy. It's just, it might require a little bit of a shift in terms of where the jobs go, in terms of, require a little bit of retraining in terms of, making sure that, the population, and we're talking about the U.S., but really applies anywhere in terms of how employees will need to think about being agile and going where the jobs are. But generally speaking, I'd say that it's a good thing. And it's just need to think about how we use that good thing in a way that safeguards against some of the risks.
So directors have to be cognizant of that, the ethical questions, and also because it has been pretty rocky sometimes, some of the technological shifts, and maybe they didn't necessarily have to be that rocky.
People have to understand that something because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, and that is something that Silicon Valley constantly has to learn over and over again. So yeah, it has been rocky, but I think that it can be course corrected.
I'm presuming it would be by the government. I mean, you can't really rely on sort of individual companies to.
Yeah. Well, just briefly, I do think that there is going to be increased. I think I think board directors and C-level management should understand there is increasing regulation in this area. I think that the California Consumer Privacy Act, which went into effect a few days ago, is a perfect example where citizens come together through statewide initiative to basically say you can't use my consumer data unless I authorize you to do so. And I think that that's the kind of thing that will continue to happen in the future as people understand the impacts of AI and technology on their lives.
I totally agree with that, John, because there's a lot of jurisdictions that are thinking about current and future policy approach to AI. The federal government, there's an AI Congressional Advisory Committee that was created in 2017, and then also in the EU, there's GDPR, there's MiFID II. All these things are around data and data use and how that applies to AI. And obviously, there's California, which you just referred to, but all of those are all around policy and how government should be thinking about AI and its ramifications.
Right. And Michael mentioned facial recognition a few minutes ago. There are many cities and local governments which are restricting the use of the collecting data via facial recognition. So that's, you see citizens banding together to take initiative in certain areas.
Okay. So circling back, in terms of job losses, in terms of directors, I think it may be self-limiting in a way. Directors are just going to say basically because they can, nope, we're going to keep our jobs. We like our jobs. We're going to use AI as a sort of tool in the boardroom, but it's not going to literally replace us because we just say it won't.
Right. No, I would agree with that perspective. I would agree that I don't think AI replaces board directors. I don't think AI replaces management. I think as you think of AI and technology to augment those decisions. There's current laws and even legislation that basically, say that human judgment is really what's important in the decision. There's not a law that says you have to follow what AI or technology says. And so I think that human oversight will continue on in the boardroom and in the C-suite.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there was a survey that I saw, which was one of the questions was around the greatest challenge or obstacle to your organization's adoption of AI technology. And the biggest driver for why an organization was not adopting was it was about 50%, and that was because of a lack of know-how and a lack of experience. So I think, fundamentally it's about getting a better understanding of the opportunity as well as the risks, but bringing that all together, I think, and I do agree with John that it's not going to replace, management, the need for management or for directors, but I think getting a better understanding of how technology works and what that can mean for, your particular organization is really critical and important in order to really drive the opportunity there.
Yeah. So there'll always be a human element to it. Can we talk specifically about how AI will augment human director decisions? Is it going to be like Alexa, kind of sitting in the boardroom chair? I'm just trying to get my head kind of around that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is I think at least in the near term, if you're a board member, what I would say is that the thing that you're probably coming across, if any, is really around innovation spend and spend related to innovation more broadly, but also specifically to AI and AI-related technologies. And so I think that's something that is pretty concrete and something that, again, I think that's tied to having an understanding and a fundamental underlying understanding of what the technology is and what it represents. And, as an example, right, if you're thinking about a technology, ultimately and an investment related to that, you have to think about competitors because competitors could, have a perceived advantage around whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's, regulatory, whether it's something else, but they might have an edge as it relates to data and AI in a way that your company may not. And so I do think that there's a whole bucket of conversation around how do you think about innovation, how do you think about investments, how does AI impact your business vis-a-vis your competitors and what's happening in the industry.
Yep, I completely agree with Michael says. I do want to go back to the imagery you had of AI sitting in a boardroom chair. But can I just kind of add to what Michael was saying first, and we'll go back to what does that actually look like in the boardroom? Mm-hmm. In that, I think that, as Michael was saying, it's around, boardrooms will have to approve innovation spend. Completely agree with that. I think that it's all part of the overall company strategy that the board members are completely involved in and obviously need to approve on a at least annual basis. And that strategy should probably include some components where different parts of the business experiment with AI, and AI can augment the learning about customers or augment customer service by use of chatbots, or how they can augment manufacturing using the use of robotics and AI. So obviously at the strategy level, I think that that's, very important. I think that there are some, audit committee issues as well too. Again, we were talking about privacy a few minutes ago, and so board members will need to think about how data is used within the company and whether consumer privacy is protected. Mm-hmm. Also, I think audit committees will have to be looking at the use of algorithms that AI use to make decisions and whether those algorithms are producing the outcomes which are reasonable to come up with. Algorithms today are used a lot in the hiring process of hiring and selecting new people to organizations, and it goes all the way up to the board level to ensure that algorithms are appropriately used so that the outcomes are appropriate for the company.
You're talking about specifically hiring and firing board members?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm talking about employing. So thank you for asking me that question. No, I'm talking really more about algorithms are used to in the selection process to hire a new employee of a company. So, for example, when someone's applying for some job, an algorithm is used to sort through all the hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes for an open position, and then there are candidates which are selected, and then obviously there are a few interviews for someone to get a job. And so algorithms are used in that way to make sure it is a management and up to the board ultimately to make sure that those algorithms are used appropriately so that the outcomes are fair to employees and you really are getting the best employees for the open roles. So hopefully that digression makes sense. What I just said, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
okay. Yeah, so going back to will be involved, algorithms be involved in the use of evaluating board members? I personally don't think so in the short or medium term. I think that there are other board evaluation tools which can and should be used that are better ways to evaluate a board member's performance. But maybe this makes sense to kind of go to your example. I don't think it's AI sitting in a board chair, but I do think it is the Amazon Echo or the Google Home speaker sitting in the boardroom. And I think that the AI will be used primarily to service data. So basically, it will aggregate consumer information and offer it to board members to offer insight into consumers. I think it will aggregate data about finances of company and to assess whether there is any variance that shouldn't be happening within different parts of the organization. I think AI will be used primarily as a way to consolidate information to be consumed at the board level to make better decisions. So that's what I think is. It's not going to be necessarily making the decision, but it's going to be pulling data together to inform the board member on what decisions may need to be made within the company.
Okay. will they say, for example, okay, algorithm, we've just heard from our M&A committee or whatever, and we should. Then they've provided us with a bunch of numbers. What do you think about their numbers? Should we make this purchase or not? Would that be a kind of? Is that how it would work? I know it wouldn't work like that, but would it work something like that?
Yeah. So Michael, I will offer my opinion, and please change and correct me if you think otherwise. I think that a board member could ask an AI machine whether the NPV is positive for an acquisition, and obviously AI could make that kind of quantitative evaluation about whether it is a positive NPV or not. Mm-hmm. But I also think that it is the board member's responsibility to understand what went into that judgment that the AI is making. This goes back to the algorithms which are used for AI. Is AI really assessing all the data that's necessary to make sure that an NPV is positive? Also, are the data sources appropriate? So is it collecting all the data from a due diligence perspective in terms of whether, and a lot of that due diligence information is qualitative, obviously, right? It's not necessarily financial. It's a qualitative decision. Is it making all those decisions as well too? And so again, I think it is possible for AI to offer that kind of opinion, but I do think that board members are still responsible for making a decision that aligns with what AI says, but also is totally fine if it makes a decision which is different from AI. Because again, there's not enough data quality, there's not enough qualitative information, there's not enough, there's not everything that's needed to make a decision like whether to acquire a company is not there in AI yet.
There's still a little bit in the gut.
Well, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, you can finish, John.
It's like, no. Well, just to answer your question, and then Michael, please correct me if I'm wrong or change what I'm saying. But, acquiring a company is a perfect example where a board director and management in particular have to take all sorts of information together, right? And I wouldn't say it's a gut decision, but it is a decision that falls one way or the other based upon all the qualitative and quantitative information. So it's both those things, in my opinion, which is currently beyond AI's capabilities to make decisions based upon qualitative and quantitative information.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with you, John. What I was going to say is that ultimately on this specific example, which I think is a really good concrete one, is that there is the quantitative component, and I think data can definitely help bring that together, and AI can help with some of the decision making around the specific quantitative metrics. But at the end of the day, with respect to an investment that you make or you buy a company or something along those lines, there's a huge qualitative component that requires judgment. And some of that is just not, in terms of, the data and what that requires, fundamentally when you have judgment, it brings together both the quantitative and the qualitative. And the qualitative sometimes is, for example, you have competitive factors and you have a competitive landscape, and you have to have an understanding of, if you acquire this company, what that means, with respect to the positioning of the combined entity, and what the trends are in the space, right. and there's quantitative components to that, but ultimately it's qualitative in terms of how you think about what's happening, and there's a judgment that's layered on both of those things, right? And that's really where I think at least at this stage, AI would not be able to replace that.
Okay, but there are decisions that AI can make alone, right? I mean, there is a case for automation. I mean, is there some part of this whole future in corporate governance that's going to be automated, or at all, or not? Will there always have to be a director sort of looking over it and going, this algorithm sounds crazy, or whatever?
I personally think the latter. I think that there's going to have to be human judgment about. There are sometimes things that won't make sense, and that's where humans have to take over the responsibility for, this algorithm, this program, this system does not make sense.
Okay. So it fundamentally won't change how corporate governance gets done. in terms of a set of directors and a chairman and boards and committees and meetings and so on, and setting strategy the way they've always done it, they'll just have this new tool to help them do it, I guess, with better, faster, smarter information.
Well, if we go back to the M&A example, right? If you make an investment, I would think about it as there's a couple criteria that you want to achieve. That there's kind of like the financial component of you want to hit this return or you want to hit this profitability metric, and every company might have a different view on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something like that, if you have the right data and it's feeding into a system, and you have a framework around, there's a financial component, there's other qualitative components, there's competitive, there's a lot of different ways in which you could think about. Whether or not, you think about integration and, if the company is the best acquirer or not, and what integration might look like, and, who is managing the company, and is that person the right leader to manage the acquired company? So there's a whole bunch of different factors. And I think, you could think about AI as providing a framework to provide a recommendation on some of the quantitative components, right? And it will help augment decision making. But I agree with John that at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you have the right data even in place in order to provide that recommendation? And if it's something that's tangible, like financial returns and profitability and revenue growth and other types of things like that, then yes. And I think in some of the other ones, right, like, do we have the right leader in place in order to lead the acquired company? Clearly, that's not something where data, and maybe you can get to a world where you start quantifying different attributes and you plug that into a machine, and maybe that'll help you make the decision. But ultimately, it does come down to the director, where they need to take all of that information and bring it together and make the decision. And so my point is, you to the extent that you have the right data, then you can bring it together, and it can provide a framework to the extent that you have that data. But if you don't, then it really will require some level of judgment that I think in the short to medium term, it's not going to take away, the way in which a director, and the responsibilities, what they're going to have to do.
There will always be situations of limited data. And
yes, exactly. And to add to that a little bit, a topic that we haven't talked about, but it totally makes sense to talk about at this point, is that AI also increases the capability of cybersecurity problems, and to be able to realize that some of the data may not be accurate and or could have been changed is incredibly important for humans and audit committees to understand and assess, to make sure that the data that's coming into making assessments and decisions is something that could possibly have been compromised. And so it is something that adds, that's another reason for human judgment.
What do you folks want to say to directors? I mean, Mike, I'm looking actually specifically at your blog about how to a map for your AI journey. You talk about building your AI strategy and kind of first steps that directors should take or boards should take when approaching all this. Is there anything we can leave our audience with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. Definitely, starting off with making sure, and this ties back to a point that John had talked about in terms of making sure that your AI strategy is tied to your overall corporate strategy, and really just understanding, first and foremost, as you think about AI, you have to think about, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to solve for? What does your business strategy look like? And use that as an assessment of the current situation first and foremost. And then thinking about, whether it's data visualization, whether it's analytics, whether it's predictive analytics or machine learning, or all of these, different applications as it relates to AI, those are dependent on the company's applications as well as the associated data.
Right.
And so just really understanding data quality, understanding data strategy, and understanding all that as it relates to the overall corporate strategy, I think is first and foremost as kind of a launching pad. And then, the second thing is really around experimentation And, there's a phrase called fail fast, and that's something that's frequently used when people think about, agile and agile design and programming methodology. But, the way that I think about it is how do you learn? The flip of that is how do you learn quickly, right? And so being agile in your approach, how do you learn quickly? How do you fail fast? And how do you experiment in a way that doesn't take you down a rabbit hole and a ton of investment, but really just trying to experiment around the edges and take that to learn as quickly as possible and figure out whether or not one specific use case is the right use case for you and your organization. And then once you sort of take that, I think a really key part of it is then the people and making sure that you have the right personnel within the organization to implement a clear AI roadmap and communicating that across the organization. And so that's around getting the right people, having the right execution strategy, and cascading that out throughout the organization.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Michael said, and certainly cannot say it better because I think he said it extremely well. And the only additional tidbit I would add is that I just remind people, board directors and management that AI is easier to implement than moving to a new ERP system. Even moving to the cloud may be more difficult than piloting AI in different parts of an organization. So the AI journey starts at a much smaller scale than an ERP move or a move to the cloud. And so that's something that companies should be experimenting with because their competitors are experimenting with it today.
Mike, on that note, can we talk about how Broadridge is integrating AI into its strategic future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the way that we think about AI as an entity is really around, how do we help our clients and how do we help them and how do we take the investments that we've made on behalf of our clients. And, we have a network and a network effect with respect to financial services. And so how do we sort of take the learnings that we get from all of our clients, bring it together, and then distribute that back and really help certain entities? And how do we become the on-ramp for certain entities as they contemplate their innovation roadmap? And, the one thing that I think about with respect to AI and Broadridge is that there's a push within financial services, specifically just more generally around, how to use AI to get cost savings. And I think that is definitely something that could be an opportunity, particularly as it relates to, robotics and robotics process automation. And I think that there's definitely merit and value when you think about, the opportunity there. But I also think that there's also another component around what is the longer term opportunity? And, that could mean whether it's, building new products, whether it's using AI to improve the customer experience. And there are things that are not only kind of, there's a short term cost savings that you can get, but there's also the longer term strategy of, how do you use AI and its related technologies to really, augment a customer experience or augment your customer acquisitions. How do you sort of create new products out of that? And so I think if the framework that I'd like to leave you with is that there's kind of short term, there's also long term, and if you can get both at the same time as you think about AI, that would be a really good thing.
And that's your Ticker Podcast. What do you think? What decisions should we allow machines to make? And if AI is indeed collaborative to humans, as John and Mike contend, what kind of responsibilities do boards and management have for the AI they create? Send your puny human thoughts to us at editorial@irmagazine.com. Thanks for listening. In Montreal, I'm Jeff Cossette.